Welcome to Learning with UNP. In this session of Python for Data Science, we are going to understand about working with ranges and looping in list. That includes introduction to range function, looping through list using a for loop, and finally looping through list using a while loop. Let's begin with understanding range function to create a list. The range function is a versatile tool in Python that is often used to generate a sequence of numbers which can be particularly useful when working with list. You can use the range function to create a list of numbers or to iterate over the indices of a list. The range function generates a sequence of numbers starting from a given start value up to but not including a given stop value. You can also provide an additional step value to specify the interval between numbers in the sequence. Here is the syntax of it. This line creates a list of numbers using the range function. It starts from the given start value, goes up to but not including the stop value, and increments by the step value. The list function then converts this sequence into a list and stores it in myRangeList. Let's look at the pseudocode representation of it. Step 1. Use the range function with appropriate arguments to generate a sequence of numbers. Means generate a sequence of numbers using the range function with the desired start, stop, and step values. Step 2. Convert the generated sequence into a list using the list constructor. Means convert the sequence into a list using the list function. Step 3. Assign the list to the variable mylist. Means assign the resulting list to a variable called mylist. This example demonstrates how to create a list of consecutive numbers using range and list. In this example, we use the range function to generate a sequence of numbers from 0 to 9. By passing the arguments 0 and 10 to range 0-10, we create a sequence starting at 0 and stopping before 10. We then convert this sequence into a list using the function list and assign it to the variable numList. We print this using the print statement. Let's execute and check. As we discussed, the output contains a list starting from 0 till 9. The second example over here shows how to create a list of even numbers using the range function with a step value. In this example, we use the range function to generate a sequence of even numbers from 0 to 8 by passing the arguments 0, 10, 2 to range of 0, 10, 2. We create a sequence starting at 0, stopping before 10 with a step size of 2, means it increments by 2. The sequence is then converted into list using the list function and it is assigned to the variable even numbers. We print the output using print statement. Let's execute and check. As discussed, the output contains a list starting from 0 ending before 10 with a step value of 2. Now let's move on to the next topic, that is looping through list. Looping through list allows you to perform operations on each element in the list. When you loop through a list, you are essentially telling Python to go through each item in that list and do something with it. Python provides two main types of loops for this purpose, for loops and while loops. Let's look at looping through list using a for loop. For loops are particularly handy for this job because they allow you to go through every element in the list one by one, making it easy to perform operations on each element sequentially. A for loop is the most straightforward way to iterate over each element in a list. This loop automatically traverses. Here is the syntax to do so. It iterates through each element in the list, mylist, one by one, assigning each element to the variable element. Within the loop, you can perform actions or operations with element, allowing you to manipulate each item in the list individually. Let's look at the pseudocode representation of it. Step 1. Initialize a list variable mylist, means create a list and store it in the variable mylist. Step 2. Use a for loop to iterate over each element in mylist, means use a for loop to go through each item in mylist one by one. Step 3. Inside the loop, process each element as needed. Means within the loop, perform actions or operations on each element as required. This allows you to process or manipulate each item individually as the loop iterates through the list. Here we have three examples demonstrating looping through list using a for loop. In the first example, we have a list called mylist containing integers from 1 to 5. The for loop iterates through each element in mylist one by one. During each iteration, the current element is assigned to the variable element. Inside the loop, we print the element using print statement, which displays each item in mylist one by one on separate line. Let's execute and check. As discussed, the elements are printed one by one in separate line. In the second example, we have a list named mylist that contains various data types, an integer, a string, a floating point number, another list, and a boolean value. The for loop iterates through each element in mylist sequentially. During each iteration, the current element is assigned to the variable element. Inside the loop, we print each element which displays each item in mylist on a separate line. Let's execute and check. As discussed, each element is printed on separate line. In the third example, we have a list named mylist containing various data types, an integer, a string, a floating point number, another list, and a boolean value. Instead of directly iterating over the elements of mylist, this code uses a for loop with range function to generate indices corresponding to each element's position in the list. During each iteration, the loop accesses the element at index I using mylist of I and print it. This approach allows us to iterate through indices of mylist and access each element individually, achieving the same result as above. Let's execute and check. As discussed, the output is printed on separate line. The difference between the second example and the third example is both examples achieve the same result of printing each item in mylist. The first example directly iterates over the elements, while the second example iterates over the indices and access the elements using their indices. The second approach can be useful in situations where you need to work with both elements and their indices. Finally, let's look at looping through list using a while loop. A while loop in Python allows you to repeatedly execute a block of code as long as a condition is true. You can use a while loop to iterate over a list by combining it with an index variable. They are typically used in scenarios where you need more flexibility, such as when the number of iterations isn't predetermined or when you are waiting for a certain condition to be met. Here is the syntax of it. This uses a while loop to iterate through each element in the list mylist. The loop continues executing as long as the value of index is less than the length of mylist. During each iteration, the code performs actions with element at current index accessed using mylist of index. After processing each element, the index is incremented by 1 to move to the next element in the list. This process continues until the loop has iterated through all elements in a list. Let's look at the pseudocode representation of it. Step 1. Initialize a list variable mylist means create a list and store it in the variable mylist. Step 2. Initialize an index variable index to 0 means initialize an index variable called index to 0. Step 3. Use a while loop with the condition index less than length of mylist means use a while loop that continues as long as the value of index is less than the length of mylist. Step 4. Inside the loop, access the element at current index and process it. Means inside the loop, access and process the element at the current index in mylist. Step 5. Increment the index after each iteration. Means increment the index by 1 after each iteration to move to the next element in the list. This example over here illustrates how to iterate through each element in a list using a while loop in Python. In this example, we have a list called mylist containing integers from 1 to 5. The code initializes an index variable called index to 0. Then it enters a while loop that continues as long as the value of index is less than the length of mylist. During each iteration, the code prints the element at the current index in mylist using print of mylist of index. After printing the element, the index is incremented by 1 using index plus equals to 1 to move to the next element in the list. This process repeats until the loop has iterated through all elements in my list, printing each item on a separate line. Let's execute and check. As discussed, each element in the list has been printed on separate line. This is all about today's lecture. See you in the next lecture. Thank you.